Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. I am here with Mary Inman. How you doing, Mary?
I'm doing great, Nick.
Thank you so much for joining us. So let's just jump in. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you work on.
So I am the rare breed of attorney who has specialized my whole career in representing whistleblowers under the U.S. Whistleblower Reward programs. But when I started out 23 years ago, there was only one U.S. Whistleblower Reward program, and that was called the Federal False Claims Act, which had been around since the Civil War. And that's anytime monies, taxpayer dollars have been squandered or embezzled or otherwise used improperly, fraudulently, then a whistleblower can bring that information to the U.S. government and receive a percentage of the recovery. But what's been so exciting for my career is that since that, because that program has been so successful, other agencies decided they wanted to get in on the act. They thought whistleblowers were really effective ways of helping them enforce their laws. So the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS, and now even a couple of years ago, the U.S. Department of Transportation all have whistleblower reward programs. So it's just been a very fortunate career for me that instead of it just staying, it sort of has ballooned upwards. So it's a great privilege to represent whistleblowers, and it's been a fabulous ride so far, and I'm looking forward to what's next.
So how does it work? Where do you get involved in the process? Do you sort of help them navigate all the red tape and doing the report? Tell us how you kind of shepherd them through the whole thing.
Well, I have a great team behind me. My firm has now the largest whistleblower practice in the world.
Cool.
And so we have offices in London, New York, DC, and San Francisco. We all play a role, but the role that I have been known to occupy is that of the whistleblower whisperer. And I think that really reflects the need for a whistleblower reflects how loaded and what a fraught decision it is for someone to decide to stick their head up above the parapet and decide to speak up. So I think a lot of what goes on, at least in the initial stages with the whistleblowers, is I think most people would realize it's a legal analysis, of course. Do you have a viable claim that would interest the United States government or any of these agencies that have programs? But it's much more than that, because a lot of it is, if the answer to that is yes, there's a whole host. The question is, should you pull the trigger? And I've spent a lot of my career not just speaking to my whistleblowers, but inviting them to bring in their spouses, their siblings, and other folks, because it's a decision that impacts not just that individual, but has a ripple effect. So I guess a lot of what goes on behind the scenes is managing the whistleblowers' expectations and talking about the parade of horribles, frankly, that could happen to them. So I guess that's a little bit of the
so that's probably a pretty heavy conversation, or can be. What sort of stuff are you talking about there? What are you trying to get this person comfortable with, and what sort of ranges of responses to these discussions do you see across your client bases?
It's a great question. So a lot of what the discussion sort of revolves around is a question of what will happen if you blow the whistle? Unfortunately, although we made a lot of progress culturally in terms of, at least Hollywood movies tell you, we're starting to
yes.
lionize some whistleblowers. The majority, and it really is industry specific, but the majority of the industries, if you were to blow the whistle in the defense sector or the healthcare industry, you're likely never to work again. So a lot of the conversation relates around how equipped are you and your family to have that reality happen. I mean, obviously there are retaliation laws that allow you, that provide a certain amount of protection, but you have to win. You have to be able to show that it was you're speaking up and not the fact that you messed up on an expense report that caused them to terminate you or take adverse employment action.
Right.
So a lot of the conversation is the parade of horribles, and I think whistleblowers are so caught up in the moment, because imagine what an intense moment it is for them that they've seen fraud at their company and they've tried to report it and they've been shut down. It's not a time when they're most level-headed. So that's why I always try and bring them back, but mostly bring them back and then even speak to their partners about or ask them, how is your partner feeling about this?
Yeah, because I'm sure so I bet that's super interesting when the partner comes in. I'm just kind of picturing sort of the typical opposites attract thing. So you have this really highly conscientious person who sees this thing happen and it's weighing on them and they have to report and they talk and it's not happening and they come and finally talk to you and their spouse comes in. And I just imagine that many times, I mean, me and my spouse, we're very different. And so what is that like? When you bring the spouse in, is it ever sort of, you've kind of worked on the whistleblower a little bit and the spouse comes in and it all kind of changes, or what is that dynamic like?
They have a lot of questions because they haven't been questions about us. They mostly want to know, who are these lawyers that you're talking to? Who are you being well advised? They want to take comfort that they feel like that person is not there just because we can, as lawyers, we stand to make a contingent, we're paid on a contingency fee basis. So we get a percentage of the whistleblower's claim. So we are financially motivated to tell that whistleblower, yes, you should file it. Yeah. But we, as being people who represent whistleblowers collectively, our group has more than 100 years experience, is that we never want to be in that situation, because that is somewhat we have these clients for life and have them come back and be devastated and not feel like we had told them everything that was
yeah, so
yeah.
You really try to sort of counteract the inherent moral hazard in your role, right?
Yeah. Well, as you say, there's an interesting scene. I just love that Hollywood has taken to whistleblowers because it's become a more relatable event, and it also helps us culturally to celebrate whistleblowers. But in the most recent movie is, I don't know if folks listening have seen Official Secrets, but it's about a UK whistleblower by the name of Catherine Gunn, she's a national intelligence whistleblower, who's being played by Keira Knightley. And there's an amazing scene in it where her husband talks about the impact on him. And the interesting part about the impact on him is that he was relying on her citizenship to be in the United Kingdom. And when she exposed the fact, she was basically listening, she was a translator in the UK's version of the CIA, and she saw a memo come across that said the United States government is asking the UK to help us wiretap offices of UN member states that were swing states in the lead up to the vote on the Iraq War. Entry into the Iraq War. And so she exposes this, and the first thing they do, the UK government does, is they come for her husband, and there's a very dramatic scene in the movie where they try and send him back home, basically expel him from the country. And so there's a tense moment between the two of them about him saying, were you not thinking about me? You were just so thinking about your country. And that you just had to do this, and why wasn't there this sort of consideration for me and now their daughter?
Right, and it's hard. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so I think that's the dilemma.
Yeah, it's like you kick off this process as a whistleblower, and you've never done it before, perhaps. I mean, there's probably not so many people like Charlie who have been burned by being a whistleblower multiple times, Like I think most of the people who probably come and talk to you, they've never done it before, especially at that level. And so how could you know what the sort of externalities of the decision are? How could you know what's going to splash up out of that, that bucket onto the people around you and affect the lives of your spouses and those other things? It's great that you guys have been through it so many times. You can help usher them through it, and so that you could at least increase the likelihood that they're going to walk into it eyes wide open.
Right. Or decide not to do it. That's the thing. I always say, here's the time where I've told you that you have a viable claim and we're ready to go forward, and now it's my time to talk you out of it.
So when you talk them out of it, what kind of stuff are you talking about? Is it general stuff, or is it kind of industry specific stuff? What sort of rocks are you sort of turning under so they can see that filthy underbelly,
A lot of it is just the brass tacks of your career prospects. And that's very industry specific. I always joke that my favorite clients are clients who are on the cusp of retirement, who have a huge nest egg. I said, and then they can throw napalm over their shoulder and they don't care. Those are the simple ones, but it's ones where I've had a number of very young whistleblowers. We have a whistleblower who was an engineer. It was his second job out of college, and he exposed shoddy manufacturing process at a manufacturing plant for PVC pipe, which is basically what supplies our water lines in municipalities. So, and they were rupturing and creating havoc. And that was a big, he was going to do it come hell or high water, but, we had very long discussions about what does this mean? And he's no longer in the industry. He moved into a different industry.
Interesting. So do you see Let's just talk about kind of three generations that are in the workplace right now. Let's talk about baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. Do you see any sort of just sort of stereotypical or like broad brushstroke differences about how like the heart of the whistleblower from these different generations, or do you feel like it's more of a personality consistent? You know what I'm saying? Is there a commonality of consistency, or is there a commonality by generation around what they value and what they're reacting to? You know what I mean?
I think that's a really great question. I can approach it that I do feel like with my client Tyler Schultz, who I would put in that would be the millennial category, I would assume. Maybe is he Gen X? I don't know.
He's
Um,
probably. Well, I'm like one of the oldest millennials, so I think he's a little bit younger than me. So I'm gonna
okay,
guess.
I think he's millennial. I think it's an interesting question because I think millennials are more likely to blow the whistle and have less concern
Right.
because they're used to, rather than boomers who realize, like, if we'll say to you, you can't, you know, leave your current job until you have your next job, and you should be there for at least 5 to 10 years, or get your silver watch for your 25th anniversary. Whereas that's not how millennials think. So I don't think they think of. I think they think that they're like Madonna; they can reinvent themselves, and I think they can, and they
Well, we
do.
can. Okay.
I think they do with, they move so quickly. So I think in Tyler Schultz's case, he's gone on after exposing Theranos to be the CEO of his own biotech company. No one's been blacklisting him there. I think, everybody wants to see if his product succeeds.
Yeah, and it's not like he had trouble getting investors and stuff because he blew the whistle, and he's still in kind of that startup space. That's an interesting thing where there's sort of some generational sensibilities that could curtail whistleblowing in one case, and in another case, just a different sort of worldview that says, you know what, I'm going to just kind of do the right thing and move forward. Obviously, that's not none of these generations are like a monolith by any means, but if you start to see these trends, it's something that we as sort of leaders could lean into to kind of get more out of them if you can feed it right.
Absolutely. But yeah, I do think the millennials are much more fearless than
Yeah.
others. And I think for that reason, I think it is very industry specific. There are certain industries where they're not forgiving.
Right.
We have seen, this is Charlie Middleton's favorite topic, and I love to support Charlie, which is that we have seen some employers actually consciously choose whistleblowers to employ them in compliance type roles and other roles, but in compliance type roles in particular, to show how serious a company is about compliance. We're so serious about speaking up that we have a known successful whistleblower as our head of compliance. So the one example I know of that is there's a famous whistleblower by the name of Martin Woods, who was a whistleblower exposed money laundering, huge amount of money laundering at Wachovia Bank. And Thomson Reuters hired him as their head of compliance. He's no longer there, but he certainly had, a decent tenure there. And that, I think, was something to be applauded, I think.
Well, I mean, it's easy to put out a press release, right? It's easy to kind of write some words on a page and get some executives together for a nice photo op of everyone signing some document and so forth. But your actions are what speak, I think. And to that point, it can be a very powerful message to send to your organization to say, hey, we're serious about this stuff. We're not just paying it lip service, as evidenced by this person who in another company or another industry may be blackballed. We're actually going to elevate this person to a point of power and use their, let their way sort of cascade across our organization. Tell me a little bit about how your practice has sort of changed a little bit, because you've been doing this for a while. I think you were saying when you got into it, there was really only, you've seen a massive expansion of these types of programs. So as this expansion has occurred, what has that meant for your business? What has that meant for your focus? And what does that meant for the impact that you see yourself making?
Yeah, I mean, the expansion has been amazing. I think specifically how it's impacted my career is that my firm has a London office. And so when I joined 5 years ago, one of the most attractive parts about the firm was that there was this London presence and a recognition that so much of the whistleblowing no longer occurs by American nationals. It's actually, at least in the case of the SEC, it's going on where they track these numbers every year, and they get the number one place that they get submissions from is the UK, and it's 10 to 15% of their whistleblower submissions come from overseas. So I think it's a recognition of that companies are multinational, and that so many, even if you're not a multinational corporation, there's usually a nexus to the United States that will often give the SEC jurisdiction or one of the agencies jurisdiction. So one example, recently we had a successful case involving a cartel. We had a whistleblower who was an insider who was privy to the fact that when the US military put out a contract in South Korea to supply gas and oil to their military bases, he recognized that all the oil companies got together and colluded to inflate the price that was charged to the American government. So that's a great example of a South Korean company, a South Korean whistleblower. And just, how did he know about the American program? There he is in Seoul. And then he ultimately decides to approach us. So I think, and that was a massive case. I think it was a $300 million case in terms all told when they dealt with all of the individual conspirator defendants. So it's just a showing that it reverberates all the way to Seoul and back. And also in Seoul, I think particularly interesting that that's an Asian culture where stereotypically it makes, I think there's an additional burden
Right.
To speaking up because there's such a priority placed on loyalty. So anyway, it's just an interesting example. So that's a long-winded way of my saying that I landed in London to basically sing the praises and sing the gospel of the US whistleblower programs internationally as a way to educate and make people aware that they can bring information to the US government and help us out.
So, I mean, as I'm kind of thinking through that 10 to 15% you're talking about, I just wonder, like, how much of the potential for international whistleblowers do you think is tapped? Do you think we just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg, or do you think that there's it could be a ton more? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's relatively untapped.
I as well.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why we really work to publicize cases of international whistleblowers, just so those people in those countries can recognize and think, hey, that's something I could do that could be helpful. The other thing I haven't mentioned that's really fascinating is that these are not just US whistleblower programs, as in most particularly sort of our most famous program, the SEC program, as it has had enormous success. There have been copycats and other countries who have flirted with the idea of adopting it, and some of whom have adopted similar programs. So for instance, our neighbors to the north, in the Ontario Securities Commission, they have a whistleblower reward program. It's only 3 years old, but they've already paid out close to, I think, 8 to 9 million in rewards. And we're seeing expansions of these programs other places as well. So there are some in Africa. There are a few, and South Korea, going back to Korea, actually has a tax whistleblower program very similar to our IRS program. So we're starting to see more of it, and we're starting to, and I think that's just a reflection of the success of the US programs, that other securities regulators say, hey, I want to get in on the action.
Yeah, it's a little fascinating to me because I'm not an expert in this realm by any means, but it's kind of interesting to me. I think I just thought like any sort of civilized country is going to have this stuff in place in all their major departments, but to hear that like the counterpart to the SEC just across the border just turned this on 3 years ago speaks, I think, to sort of across the globe that this is really just burgeoning. Like we're nowhere near full saturation of sort of whistleblower programs to really root out this wrongdoing that's happening behind the scenes, which is just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, and I think you see a correlation between countries who are very much looking to attract foreign investors, want to show that they have transparency and accountability. Gotcha. And this is one way that they can, and that's certainly been the experience with South Korea. They've gone on a big bent over the past 5 years, adopting laws and other things to be serious, saying we're serious about having a rigorous enforcement sector in place so that you can be safe enough to bring your business here and establish business here. So that certainly has helped in certain areas. But we've even seen Saudi Arabia talking about having whistleblower protections, and just last week, a whistleblower reward, which to me, I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. It'll of course remain to be seen if anyone feels safe enough to use it. The fact that they're paying lip service to me is really a reflection of how far we've come.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. when you just said that, I think it helped me kind of step into your shoes and see like your world a little. When you said, I don't think I'd ever see that in my lifetime. It just speaks to, I think, the potential and the sort of pockets of, opacity, to kind of the accountability that, or the transparency that, we want to bring to get that foreign investment. I don't know. It's just kind of a mind-boggling thing that, it's accelerating faster, and then also just, again, I'm still wrapping my head around it.
Well, one of the things that was most interesting to me upon arriving on the shores in the UK was that despite with the American accent, as if I would talk, there are big cultural impediments and a lot of cultural baggage that makes people viscerally have a knee-jerk reaction against paying whistleblowers. And that was 100% for the first year and a half that I was there. That was the reaction that you would get universally is, oh, you're an American. Americans can only need to be paid to do the right thing. We're British, we do it because it's the right thing to do. And so I started.
That can create kind of a false sense of security if you think that, well, just culturally, we just speak up when we say something, so no one's speaking up, so there must not be anything wrong happening here. It just creates a really interesting dynamic.
So what was really interesting is we started working with, there's a marvelous group called the All Party Parliamentary Group. It's a group that's affiliated with Parliament that basically has a bunch of MPs who dive deep into a particular issue. So they have like 300 APPGs on different issues, but the APPG on whistleblowing are sort of they had that visceral reaction when we first started talking. And then the more they dug behind it and recognized that, why is it that the whistleblower who's speaking up in the public interest should be bearing all the costs? So how are we going to, and if we describe it not as a reward or God forbid a bounty because we're American pirates,
yeah, right.
We describe it as a safety net, that it is there, not unlike unemployment insurance. That was what we were able to do to get it in a vocabulary that translated. And now I'm pleased to report that the head of that group is pushing for whistleblower compensation and safety net.
See, sometimes you just gotta just present it a little bit differently, and then it's easier to go down. That's so interesting though, presenting it in sort of a self-serving, individualistic, kind of pragmatic way. They just totally reject out of hand because it's such a contrast to their sort of self-identity or something.
Right, and so we say that, if you could assure our clients that they aren't going to have negative repercussions, I'm sure our clients would blow the whistle without needing this sort of a safety net. But until that day comes, and I always say it in terms of my whistleblower whispering story, you imagine talking to that person's spouse and telling them what they're about to do. And when you see the risks they're about to undertake. And, in the UK, just like in the US, there's, tons of whistleblower horror stories where they're casualties along the side of the road. And people are now wise to that and saying, if we need these, particularly in the times of COVID, there's remarkable amounts of money that every government has earmarked for COVID relief, and that we've seen, in the United States, there's people buying Lamborghinis and other things with their paycheck. Yeah, I mean, and they're seeing similar fraud with the furlough program and the PPP program in the UK. So I think we're at a time of a lot of awareness and recognition and appreciation for the role whistleblowers can play, because government, whistleblowers are the eyes and ears of the government, and when the government is understaffed or when there's so much money sloshing around and we're moving too quickly, we really need those eyes and ears.
Yeah, the crisis creates a moral hazard, and the moral hazard can lead to fraud. And if you don't have anyone to speak up about it, then that's just going to continue to perpetuate.
Yeah.
So you're very passionate about this. You said, man, I'm so lucky I landed in this thing and it's just grown. Tell me about how you got into it. What prompted you to sort of go this way? And what is it about this whole game that you're in that you just love so much? What really resonates with you? What's kind of the root of your passion for this field that you're in?
Well, I went into this because my parents will tell you, I was always arguing from a very young age. And so I think one of those annoying people who always knew I wanted to be a lawyer because I just felt the injustice in, in the most minute of circumstances. So I fell into this area just because it was a very unusual practice group. There were very few law firms doing this at the time that I took the jump. And in a way, it was rather risky because it's particularly risky because at that point, the Supreme Court had not yet validated the law and said it was constitutional. Because remember, what's so radical about the whistleblower law is that whistleblowers are allowed to stand in the shoes of the government and file a lawsuit on their own behalf. So what we were fortunate for in the US Supreme Court decision that said that this mechanism, the whistleblower mechanism, is constitutional, is that it goes back to the founding fathers. So even Scalia and Thomas could say that they could get behind it. But when I started, there was no such Supreme Court decision. I was relying on one statute for my whole career, and
Wow.
it was not very diversified. So I've just had I've been able to
write. I mean, that's kind of a big deal. You know what I'm saying? That you're like, all right, I'm going to roll the dice and just sort of run down this bridge. I don't even know if it's fully, there's slats across the whole chasm or not.
And I think in my mind, I thought, well, if it doesn't work out, I get to spend a lot of time with U.S. prosecutors because I've always thought maybe I would be a prosecutor. So,
yeah.
And that's been interesting too, because I love to describe, a good friend of mine gave me this analogy, and I think it's great. I love to describe the practice that we do as whistleblower lawyers as being a woman in a medieval court, because we don't have any of the power, but we whisper into the ears of those who do. So we don't have subpoena power. We bring these cases to the government, and while the government's investigating, and initially it's mostly the government that gets to decide, should we open a criminal investigation? Should we wire up someone? I don't get to make those decisions, but I get to feed that information. So for me, I think that has been, it's been very fun to not work for the government, to still be at a small private entrepreneurial law firm. But still have an outsized effect. And I think part of why the statutes have worked so well is it creates a public-private partnership where you have privately funded companies who are sort of nipping at the heels of the government saying, we have all these resources we can give you, you're understaffed, we can help you here. Let's work as a partnership. And it's been, as we can see, as the numbers show, it's been enormously successful. So it's been an incredibly rewarding practice. But I mean, I get to deal with, every day I wake up and someone's whispering in my ear about a particular fraud of massive scale. And that's something to wake up for every day. Not all of them pair out. Some of them are people with tinfoil hats, but a lot of the time it does bear out. For instance, at Tyler Schultz, that's a once in a lifetime sort of story, and to be part of his story.
What a wild story that is, by the way.
Yeah. So, I mean, to get that in your inbox or to hear those calls every day, I think that's part of the excitement of the practice, is that there are individuals who have stuck their necks out to bring the information forward, and you get to assist them in their journey, which is a wild and woolly journey. It's not a short journey.
Yeah, it's like your journey for justice, and you can kind of Sherpa them up that mountain because they've never done it before, and they can't even imagine what that ascent is going to look like, I'm sure.
Yeah, we always joke and say our clients are never happiest with us as after we first filed their complaint, right? Because we've fully immersed ourselves in the issue. We said, this is it, we filed the complaint. And then of course, as we go down, the government may choose this theory and not that. And so sometimes they're disappointed in the result. The government didn't settle for as much as they thought.
Yeah, but that's the high point, right? It's like, okay, we got it, we sent it, here we go.
You're my hero, right? You're my hero. You gave voice to me in a federal complaint, and we served it. And
pretty much everybody who comes to you, they've already sort of extinguished their opportunities to report inside.
That is very true. So that's certainly our experience in our practice group, but it's also reflected in the numbers from the SEC. 80% of the people who report to the SEC have gone internally first. But it's sort of intuitive, isn't it? That, I mean, I think there is a fear amongst people that is not justified, that if you offer people financial incentive, they're going to immediately drop their career and all of their training, and they're going to immediately go jump and report externally first. It's just not what people do. People, have spent a long time within an organization. They want to see it succeed. And they very much, and the other thing I think I've said to you before is that I think there's a presumption most people think whistleblowing is a conscious choice. A lot of my whistleblowers, by the time they've come to me, that was just part of their job. Their head of audit, they revealed some numbers that did not look good for the next quarterly earnings report. And all of a sudden they're being treated like a pariah.
You're right.
So,
Like, I didn't even know I was whistleblowing. Seems like I might be whistleblowing given how everyone's reacting to me.
exactly. So that part can be difficult.
Yeah, that can be difficult. When I just think there's a universal truth that the fear of loss is greater than the desire for gain. And so someone's not going to just blow their job, blow their career, or to your point, sort of jump in blindly to something without a high confidence that like that gain is going to come. What's probably going to supersede it is the known loss that they're going to experience. And that's really what keeps people from gaming it. Look, obviously some people game it, right? Some people,
and there's always going to be someone who is.
But it's not like the overwhelming majority of things you see. You're like, you're not going into a new potential client interview being like, let's see what this liar has to say, right? I mean, based on your experience, it's somebody who's probably genuine, and you get tipped off of that tinfoil hat at some point when it starts peeking out underneath their wig or something. Yeah.
What's interesting too, Nick, is that so we say 80% of whistleblowers go internally first. What about those 20%? I would hazard that those 20% are people who know that who they're reporting to in the reporting chain are actually complicit.
Exactly.
Those are the ones when, you say, why bother? Why can I report? It doesn't make any sense. It's not going to change. So I think that's important vantage point, is that I think that's why most people report, and when they don't, it's because they think it's futile, not because they don't want to.
So we've been talking about this from sort of a bottom-up perspective, right? You're dealing with people who are kind of falling out of these situations, and you're helping them put their case together and blow the whistle on a government level, right? And so a top-down perspective is looking at the government piece of the puzzle, the incentives that they're putting in place to provide a safety net if you're on one side of the pond, or an incentive if you're on the heartless side of the pond. But like the battleground is in the middle. The battleground is inside of corporations and organizations. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights about that battleground. What do you see consistently along the way across these cases from an organizational perspective, and where does the breakdown happen? Because despite what a lot of people may say, I don't think most organizations are just like these evil empires. It's usually some well-intended people here, some well-intended people here, a bad actor over here that ends up sort of, spoiling the whole thing. So from an organizational standpoint, what do you think there?
I love to talk to compliance professionals because I say, and I mean this sincerely, I hope you put me out of business. And I feel like you could put me out of business, and I would love that. Unfortunately, fraud is rampant, so I don't have to worry too much about being put out of business. But my hope is that, given these statistics and what I have observed, is that our clients, and it's not just 80% of the SEC, another study says that whistleblowers don't just try one, not two, they try 4 times to tell you before they go externally. So my view is that if you're listening and you're creating a culture where people feel safe to report, you're going to get that information, and it's never going to have to metastasize into a public relations nightmare and a potential SEC or government investigation. So I think so much of it, there is so much that the companies can do, and that's why I hope that it never has to get to our point. So my first point is listen to them. They're talking to you and they're telling you, and in fact, they come to me with documents that show I put in the chain, I reported orally, now I put in the chain and copied the supervisors. Like, they are really sticking their necks out because they wanted to change, and then they themselves want to be protected, right? If you're very high up, you're a director of audit, and you're being told to basically bury the results, if you're going to stay in that job, all of a sudden you have exposure. So you're going to start copying people above you on your chain to sort of say, are you okay with this? Do you see? Or I'm not going to be the one signing this. I mean, there's been interesting in some of our healthcare fraud cases. I've had clients who are responsible for signing basically the documentation to the United States. In one case, it's called the cost report, where they submit to the United States how much money they have incurred and how much they should get back from the Medicare, Medicaid programs. They refuse to sign. They won't sign the certification because of exposure. So I feel like you're going to get a lot of signals. Even in the worst corporation, you're going to get signals. Tyler Schultz and Theranos repeatedly put it in paper and talk to both Sunny Balwani and Elizabeth Holmes about it. But, they were all drinking the Kool-Aid. So my number one point is if you're listening, they will tell you. And so, and it's interesting. I know I've talked to everyone until I'm blue in the face about some marvelous research coming out of the George Washington University by Professors Kyle Welch and Professor Stephen Stubens of University of Utah. And they've taken Navex Global's entire data set, and they have been able to determine that companies that have active reporting hotlines where they're receiving lots of calls are actually much healthier and more profitable than those who have a silent one. And, I love how Kyle describes it, because he says it's like being the parent of a teenager. If your children are speaking to you, you can correct course. If they're not, by the time they get to you, it's far too late. So I think so much of it is about being serious about not just walking the walk, but not just talking the talk, but walking the walk about, we have a speak up hotline. Everyone has to have one. We've been required to after Sarbanes-Oxley, right? We all have to have one, but don't outsource it. Make it, and make it part of your culture. If you call up and there's someone, who has no affiliation with your company who's telling you what to do, I think that sends a signal.
What is that? What about the anonymous piece?
Oh, so I think the anonymous piece is vital. And it's just because of my experience in our practices that I can't tell you how many people I am missing as potential whistleblowers by virtue of the fact that we cannot, certainly for some tech-savvy whistleblowers, just by filling out my intake form, you're leaving some little footprint. So I think what's been really helpful in the past 5-10 years is the advent of some really robust software that will allow for two-way anonymous reporting that will actually give whistleblowers the safety to feel like I can start an initial conversation with someone, and I can actually, instead of just dropping that white manila envelope on your desk and walking away, there can be a back and forth. And that is where you can actually engender the trust of the whistleblower, and then maybe they'll actually be willing to tell you who they are. But as an initial matter, and I think most of them probably would.
Agreed.
But as the course of action, unless you can let them start reporting anonymously, I think you're going to miss a lot of reports.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And unless you just want to have a kind of a comment box, which basically turns everything into some kind of message in a bottle that someone's just throwing over the side of the boat, hoping that it gets to, where it's got to go. If you have some way to do that correspondence, it can do a lot to engender trust, to your point, to that individual. And you also don't know what those knock-on effects are, because everyone talks to some friend at work, right? No fraud happens where just one person sees it. I mean, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but most of the case, there's somebody else who sees it. There's somebody else who wants to speak up. And to your point, I think what we found in our data, particularly for things that sort of don't end up getting addressed and moving forward, the same thing you're talking about with respect to, hey, I tried internally and then now I went to the government. People have many times tried internally before they've even called the hotline or before they've gone to the web thing to report it. And when they're, and there's usually, again, who knows, but there's usually some kind of a feedback that they got in-house that's causing them to try to lean into that anonymous report, because again, everyone's got that self-preservation as their main priority. You got rent to pay, you got food to put on the table, you got shoes to put on your kids. So those are all things that end up feeding into this anonymous piece. But to your point, if you don't have a mechanism to have that conversation, the odds of that initial, message in the bottle containing everything you need to adjudicate that claim is extremely low. So then you end up having there's smoke somewhere. I don't know where the fire is. What do I do with this thing? And it ends up creating a lot of anxiety on the investigation side or on the company side, because again, there's departments there that people, conscientious people who take that stuff seriously, who don't want that stuff going on in the organization, and they can't affect it. How can an organization, you think, okay, we got the technology in place, we got the code of conduct in place, how can they really kind of reinforce this commitment to this speak up culture that we both kind of agree is the healthier type of a culture to get people to have that conversation?
I would love to see companies including in their annual performance evaluations a plus factor, or just basically to show to reflect, because that's what people look at. If you're going to walk the walk, you're actually saying, this is something I'm going to evaluate you on. Are you someone who tells us the bad news, not just the good news? That sort of thing. And I think you should reward people who do speak up. And I think it needs to be, and the signal needs to be sent not just to that individual whistleblower, but more broadly within the corporation. So I've often had people, when they hear about the government paying rewards, a couple of very entrepreneurial people have come up to me afterwards and said, why don't we just pay rewards? Wouldn't that help sort of make it less enticing to go to the government? I said, well, it certainly makes it less enticing, but it also sends the signal that you mean what you say, that you not only value, that you actually financially value it. So I think that's, and that's where I have a lot of sympathy for corporations, because I feel like with your compliance program, you there's no room for leniency. You mess up one time and it's done. Like, you might as well scrap it, fire everybody, and start from scratch, because no one believes in it. So I have sympathy that it's not an easy thing to do, but if you can get people to use it, then, and you're on a roll, then you're going to hear what you need to hear.
I've never thought of that idea of a company providing those same kind of monetary benefits for speaking up. But to your point, you kind of get it from both angles. You can attack the speak up thing from both angles. One, you can, provoke people to speak up because they're going to respond to that incentive perhaps. But then also to your point, it sends that broader message that this actually matters. We're not just paying lip service, to it. We're putting our money where our mouth is. And, what's nice about culture, I think, that's really what we're talking about at the end of the day, right? Like, is this a culture where someone can speak up? They can feel safe. Hey, we have a true commitment to continuous improvement, and I want to hear the good news and the bad news, and we're going to celebrate the wins, and we're going to learn from the losses and tweak them and stuff like that. If people don't believe that, there's not really much for them to do in that culture, in terms of like really exhibiting the true ownership that I think is wired within all of us. So then what happens? It just turns into sweep things under the rug, or you have to do something with that dissonance, right? Like, we all know right from wrong. You see something wrong, what are you going to do with that? You either are going to you're going to lean into your ownership and say, well, this is my place, that's not going to stand here, or you're going to lean into your apathy and say, well, nothing's going to happen at all. And I think it's kind of a binary thing.
Yeah. I think the other piece that we talked about earlier is hire a whistleblower, a known whistleblower, continue to hire them. That again shows that you value those people. And I've often talked about whistleblowers being the CEO's best friend. And I've learned to speak about whistleblowers in business school speak, and to say they're not just the CEO's best friend, they are forward indicators of risk for you.
Yeah.
And if you start to speak in their language, then they start to recognize, hey, because I think the term whistleblower is so loaded. That I would love to see, some business speak, and that's why we don't call them whistleblower hotlines. We say speak up hotlines, compliance hotlines.
Right.
But I think that's the takeaway, is that you need to see who they are, because as we all know, it's only people who love you who tell you the bad news, right? Like, you have a piece of kale stuck in your teeth, you need to deal with that.
Right.
So.
Is that it?
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. It's interesting. I've seen some companies now. I know. I'm trying to think of I'm now spacing on the Big Four accounting firm that hired a CEO who was all about compliance and was really taking big steps.
Was that the
No. What's
KPMG?
No, keep going.
WC?
No.
Running out here.
Yeah, I'll think of it. I'm sorry, it's horrible. I'm forgetting. But
it must be the other one, because I named 3 of them.
It's 2 names, but I can't remember. Anyway, so they hired a female CEO who was all about compliance, and it was really interesting because I thought they had an opportunity there where there was so much going on in terms of scandals with Big Four having rubber stamped the books of a lot of companies that had big problems.
Yeah.
And there's certainly a lot of call to action as accountancies, as enablers, certainly by the UK government in the past couple of years. And they were really trying to carve out a niche for themselves as more of sort of like, we are the compliant. Yeah. And I was so hopeful, and it totally didn't work.
Really? Why do you think it didn't work?
I don't know. Well, I just don't know if they were able to. That's a long-term investment. If you're going to take that new kind of strategy and say, we're the super ethical accountancy firm, then if you got to have a board that's willing to back you and say, you know, it may take us a while to rejigger and our marketing so that we get the right clients. So it's a long-term commitment. It's not something she's going to turn around overnight and fix.
Got it.
Very disappointed to see when she was basically let go, or she decided to leave.
Yeah. You know, it's like turning a battleship at some level. You know, if you're in this established industry with all these sort of tentacles all over the place and these different offices and different jurisdictions that have different cultures, that have different, you know, feelings toward fraud, right? Some
Right.
places will call it bribe, some people will call it a, you know, another place that's just called the cost of doing business.
Right.
And that's an interesting thing to navigate. I read this book by Rob Chestnut called Intentional Integrity, and he was talking about his time at eBay. And he was talking about how they decided sort of corporately, I think this was eBay, they were deciding sort of corporately, we're not going to take bribes anywhere. You know what I'm saying? And they got to, you know, India, and there was a bunch of like, you know, kind of time to pay the bribe. And they just said, we're not doing it. We went straight to the government. The government got involved because they wanted eBay's business there and stuff like that. And they were able to kind of clear the way for them. But as I was kind of thinking about that, this is going to be a new term I'm making up, but like there's almost like a integrity privilege that comes along with size and scale that some smaller organizations can never attain. Because like if you have a 5-person logistics firm that's trying to do something in India, what are you going to do? You know, what are you going to do? Go to the government and they're gonna move mountains for you? They're probably going to ask for the handout, right? So what do you know? I just think those are some interesting challenges, and especially as these programs start to expand around the world, especially as the conglomeration of these multinationals continues to, you know, grow. There's more and more of this happening, and there's less and less sort of avenues for folks to speak up across these lines.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think your point to the bigger corporations, the eBays of the world, is sort of this: with great power comes great responsibility. You have the resources to do the right thing. So in a way, it feels like it's more incumbent upon them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they're kind of they're on the frontier of it, and they can, because they swing a bigger stick, they can help bring some of that transparency and that sort of American way of doing business into sort of some more of these sort of, you know, corporately corrupt countries. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting. It used to be that it was really the United States government was on the forefront of putting forth the FCPA concept, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and saying that we're going to prosecute people who are paying bribes to foreign government officials. And, you know, a lot of the initial concept was the United States, why are you the police officer to the world? And, you know, this is just the way that we do business. But I've taken a lot of comfort in the fact that the UK has a bribery act. There's something called SAP-2 in the EU that, you know, it's certainly, someone has to step forth and be the first one to say it.
Right, that's right.
We were derided and chided. But, you know, now we've seen other countries coming along and having similar legislation. I think that's a parallel to the eBay.
It's absolutely a parallel.
eBay's a big, you know, some smaller companies not going to have the leverage to get the Indian government involved, but eBay can.
Yeah, they can perhaps drive some real change, to your point, that can change the business landscape there, or how business is done in a meaningful way. So where do you see the biggest gap in, you know, a lot of the people that are your clients, again, are in organizations that have a compliance function, they have an HR function, they have these things in place. I have found personally that the people in these roles are not these like apathetic people. These are high integrity people. They're high conscientious people. They actually care. But it's like they're wrapped in an organization. Maybe it's a leadership issue. Maybe it's a middle management issue. I don't know, that allows this stuff to happen. And basically you have this sort of oil and water within a culture. I mean, it happens in every company. Our challenge, I think, is to, you know, my whole thesis with this game that we're in is that these functions are the most underutilized assets, strategic assets in companies. They're viewed as cost centers. They're viewed as, I need a hotline. Okay, just set one up, when it can really drive so much. Again, it's going to be indirect. It's going to be a secondary implication of it. But they can drive so much goodness and so much value in an organization, not just from a dollar's bottom line perspective, but from an equality of work and equality of life and a sort of triple bottom line impact perspective. What do you think, or what advice would you give, since you're on kind of this other side of this thing, what advice would you give somebody who's in one of these roles, who's sitting at the kiddie table, so to speak, who's viewed in the pigeonhole cost center, to really help elevate and turn those light bulbs on at the top. You know, you already said forward indicators of risk. That's a great sort of speaking their language type of a tactic. But what other sort of flowers in that bouquet of influence would you impart on the listeners?
Well, I think one of the things that just occurred to me in another conversation you and I had is that compliance officers and officials are very much whistleblowers themselves, because they are seen as cost-centered, and they are seen as only telling the bad news and always, you know, getting in the way of us taking this next big startup move in whatever startup culture, and even in established companies culture. So I think that I would encourage compliance officers to think about the sort of parallels that exist between them and whistleblowers, and then maybe use some of those tactics that we as whistleblowers use, which is, I'm sorry, but we have to play the heavy. And if you're not listening to us, and I know you are, you know, I'm at one point in the tree and there are people above me, but I will make a paper record that establishes, you know, what is going on here. I think part of the problem that compliance officers have is because they're not always a direct, you know, they're not always a separate part in the organizational chain in the chart. They're, you know, they're behind and have a lot of people who can override them. I'd love to see them move up in the organizational chart so that they're not perceived by a lot of whistleblowers that come to me as compliant officers, not compliance officers. They feel like there's no point, not because they don't like the people in the compliance roles, it's just they know that they don't have their voices don't carry the way. So it's been such an interesting topic that people are talking about. Why don't we have, and I don't know if this is your idea, Nick, but why don't we have accountancies firms that come in and rubber stamp your books? Why don't we have ethics firms that do something similar? I think
like a compliance audit. That's not just, hey, you need to have this program in place, but there's a letter that's written, and there's a deficiency, and there's an opinion given about the state of the compliance program and of action on, So I love the idea. I mean, I kind of came out of accounting. So that makes a lot of sense to me, to have that impartial thing. And there's so much value in that process, right? Just having an audited financial statement, knowing that, hey, that CFO's got to sign off on this, and a sort of supposed impartial third party is going to come in and view the results of these financial records. It drives a lot of goodness, right? And there's a lot of leakage in the compliance function, because to your point, it hasn't fully formed yet. It doesn't have that seat. It doesn't have those, you know, those claws haven't grown yet out of it. Maybe that's a bad way to put it, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't have those teeth yet.
Yeah. No, and I think, you know, I would also tell that person in compliance, you know, how am I more effective? There's all of this great research, like Kyle Welch's research and Professor Steuben's research, that basically was able to show that by whistleblowers reporting, it had a positive effect on the bottom line. I think that's always going to be what carries the way in the boardroom and in the C-suite. And if we can show that, and we can now empirically, it's stuff we've known intuitively, now we can say empirically, you have fewer lawsuits, you have fewer enforcement actions, and the lawsuits that are brought against you settle for far less. So you can sort of show quantitatively that, and that's that, you know, the NAPEX global database is a massive amount of data this isn't just an anecdotal, you know, look at
it's a full data set that gives you a picture of what's going on in corporate America and what kind of activity is occurring. You know, the interesting part though about, you know, I know I talk about this a lot, but like, the interesting part about what you just described is you're like, you got to kind of cut the steak up for these guys, and you got to put it into little, you know, and you got to maybe even chew it up for them and serve it up to them so that they can make this connection between, you know, lower employee churn and higher profits, or less lawsuits and higher profits. It's a very interesting thing, because no one's asking about how much weight am I losing from this salad I'm eating today on my diet. You know what I'm saying? Like, you just know, if I do the right things, I'm going to get those good outcomes, even though I can't, you know, attribute each action and each dollar to this person didn't quit today because of this program we have in place. You know, it's just kind of an interesting dynamic that we even have to have the conversation. But I think it's kind of an interesting opportunity for us to actually get those light bulbs turned on, because we're not talking about rocket science here. This is all human stuff. You know what I mean?
Right, we're not. And I think the other thing that's happened is that if I were in that meeting with my higher ups as the compliance officer, I would have a slide deck that shows the parade of horribles. Let's talk about how many whistleblowers tried to tell VW that they were using emission cheating devices. Let's talk about a number of whistleblowers, and what has that done to the VW brand?
Correct it.
Look at Boeing. How many, we have a client who's a Boeing whistleblower who, was a military officer before he came to Boeing. He went and told everyone he could tell. And when the company didn't listen, he went to the FDA, the FTA, they didn't listen. So he ultimately ended up talking to Congress. But again, so these are household names that have had enormous, imagine how many planes have been grounded by Boeing as a result of this. And that could have, so I think that's what I would want to show is that the consequences are dire. What these people, in so many cases, from Enron to Theranos to any of them, it was something that was preventable.
Yeah, totally preventable. And it's kind of cheapening it to use this analogy, but it's just like an insurance policy, right? Like no one's got to argue with the CEO to get car insurance for his Tesla. You know what I'm saying? Like that's very easy math for him to do. Man, if I wreck this thing, I'm screwed. But that same logic seems to sort of fall out as we step into our organizations and look at this arguably more complex system.
Yeah. And I think it just has to be more of a culture of, and I think this is the perspective I have now from having spent 3 years in the UK. I think Americans in particular we are such perfectionists, and we don't, we're now only teaching our children to celebrate mistakes, but that's not the culture that we come from. And that's certainly not reflected in the boardroom. So
right.
I think a lot needs to change because, there's a lot of yes culture that we just want to tell the people in the position what they want to hear, and then we will continue to make our way up the chain. And we've seen what happens to people who disagree.
Well, and the example you gave about if your teenagers aren't talking to you, you have a problem. If they are talking to you, great. That kind of corresponds to this Welsh, study, right? Where you see more reports from the healthier companies. And it also corresponds to all that Edmondson research. I just read that book, The Fearless Organization, and she talked about, I can't remember if we talked about this, but she was talking about the study they did of sort of good medical teams and bad medical teams, and how there was an inverse correlation between the good teams and the number of problems that came up on them. And the point is that the best teams aren't scared to talk about the problems. Because look, life is a bunch of good things and a bunch of bad things. So if you're only hearing about the good things, to your point, if you're only hearing about the good things, you're not getting the full picture, for sure. And if your desire is truly continuous improvement and you truly believe that, hey, reality is our friend, then you're going to place equal value on both things, because your company and your culture and who you are is just an accumulation, a sum total of all the things you accept and all the things you reject. So if you don't have anything to ever reject, right, you're just hearing a bunch of good things, well, then that's a bad diet. You know what I mean? So I love that idea. And I think that's really where our battle culturally needs to come from, or it needs to focus, I think, on that frontier of perfectionism, because it's an ideal that's, while noble to pursue, is never attainable. And there's a lot of bad stuff that happens that, to your point, are not game enders per se. Those can be tuition if you use those as opportunities to learn.
Yeah, and I do think it's a uniquely American. A lot of countries have it, but it's we've left so little room. We all have such, the fantasy companies that are so perfect and do everything right. We all have our trust in Elon Musk that he's going to save the world,
Move us to Mars, maybe.
It's just, yeah.
Well, this was a lot of fun, Mary. Thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you if someone is sitting on a whistleblowing thing? How can they get in touch with you for you to kind of pull out your cape and save the day? Learn more about your work.
Sure. So I'm a partner at Constantine Cannon. So our website is www.constantinecannon.com. You can find me on the website. I'm at Mary Inman 94 on Twitter. I'm a regular on LinkedIn. I'm always talking about these issues and learning from folks like yourself. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, our website, anywhere. Always happy to talk to anyone in extremis or not in extremis, but unfortunately most of my clients are in extremis by the time they call.
Well, you're fighting a two-front war, so I appreciate you coming on here and sharing some of your day with us and sharing some of your insights. Appreciate you. Have a great day.
Likewise. Thanks, Nick. I really appreciate having a chance to talk to the Compliance Line team.
Absolutely.